The Battle of Saratoga is widely discussed as the turning point of the American Revolution. The conflict between the American colonists and the British Empire drastically changed at Saratoga. The Americans gained a decisive edge in the American Revolution because of the poor military choices by the British, the failures of British General John Burgoyne, and the formal recognition of America's independence by France. The amazing story of the American Revolution can be seen from the many battles and biographies of men that fought. The Battle of Saratoga was no different. In fact, it was one of the greatest battles in the world. Edmund Bailey O'Callaghan states that the Battle of Saratoga has always attracted a large share of intelligent and interested attention. Its important results have induced a recent English author to class it preeminently among the 15 decisive battles of the world. The principal commanders of this battle were General Horatio Gates for the Americans and General John Burgoyne for the British. This battle had shown the very fortuitous events that greatly favored the American forces. The events in other battles leading up to Saratoga proved 1777 was a very decisive year. In fact, John Luzader, in his book Saratoga, A Military History of the Decisive Campaign of the American Revolution, says, "The stunning reverses in the field saved the American cause from its pending ruin, born of the continuing British victories and its own disillusionment. Such was the precarious state of the Revolution in early 1777, and why that year proved to be a decisive one." The research of this important battle will also look into the economic implications of Saratoga to see, if any, on the British defeat and its impact in England afterwards. The early battles leading up to Saratoga, starting in April 1775, where the first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord, to May of that first year saw the British Fort Ticonderoga fall without a single shot. We see many early American victories. Like in June, the Battle of Bunker Hill occurs and the Patriot forces withstand two British regular forces, but on the third, run out of ammunition and are forced to retreat. Although they lose the battle, the British casualties are over 1,000. And Robert Middlecoff records the words from British General William Murray stating the Americans' plan ought to be to lose a battle a week till the British Army was reduced to nothing. Hoping to recruit Canadians to the cause, December 1775, Patriot forces under General Richard Montgomery and Colonel Benedict Arnold would attack the British forces at Quebec, but fail, and General Montgomery would be killed in the attack. After many Patriot victories, the Americans would end the year on a disastrous note in Quebec. So February of 1776, Congress would send Benjamin Franklin, Samuel Chase, and Charles Carroll to Montreal to convince the Canadians to join forces, but the Commission was unable to do so. Had the Patriot forces been successful in winning at Quebec, perhaps they would have joined. 1776 proved to be a year of highs and lows. In January, Thomas Paine produces Common Sense, providing a strong feeling for American independence, as over 1 million copies were sold throughout the colonies. Then, in March, the British evacuate Boston after Henry brings cannons from Fort Ticonderoga. And the Patriot forces capture Dorchester Heights and surround the British. That July, Thomas Jefferson writes and submits the Declaration of Independence, which the Continental Congress approves on July 4, 1776. But then, Patriot forces were dealt a series of horrible defeats starting in August in the Battle of Long Island, where the British forced the Patriots to retreat to Manhattan. The American forces continued to retreat, and by October 1776, Washington is chased from White Plains, New York by Cornwallis. Then, in the November Battle of Fort Washington, was one of the worst defeats for the Patriots, as over 3,000 were captured. That brings us to December 1776. It was not a great year, but the Patriots gained a much-needed victory on December 26 as Washington makes his historic crossing over the Delaware and captures 1,000 German mercenaries at the Battle of Trenton. The battle took just a little over an hour, and Washington had only a few wounded. Then, as 1777 begins, the American Revolution will be a series of blows and counterblows, favoring the British at first. We see Patriot forces start the year out with a victory at Princeton, but not much success after that, as the British follow up with a victory at Ticonderoga. Starting in April 1777, the British are taking control of the New England colonies, and General John Burgoyne begins to promote his plan to divide the colonies and defeat the colonial rebel forces. In July, the Patriots would see defeat at Brandywine on September 11th, then at Germantown on October 4th from the hands of Admiral Howe. The three principal British leaders would be Admiral Richard Howe, General John Burgoyne, and the American Secretary Lord George Germain. Admiral Howe, it would seems, may have favored the Americans and many times was very hesitant to act either as not to lose too many of his men or to save his power and influence in Parliament, where for many years his family wielded great power. In fact, there were numerous times where George Washington was able to narrowly escape Howe due to his slow movements. John Burgoyne, after securing permission from Germain, begins to prepare his plan to split the New England from the rest of the colonies. And here is where we see some of the many problems of the British leadership. Burgoyne's plan was threefold. He would come down from Lake Champlain to Albany, a second force under Lieutenant Colonel Barry St. Leger from Oswego west towards Albany, and Howe would come up from New York to meet at Albany. Middlecoff, in his book Glorious Revolution, states that the British strategy lacked the simplicity of the Americans. Until Howe evacuated Boston in March of 1776, the ministry had no strategy at all. He later adds that it might be argued they never arrived at one. Lord Germain, dealing with the pressures of Parliament and perhaps allowing politics to dictate his decisions, failed to communicate plans from Burgoyne to Howe. Burgoyne plans to split the New England colonies from the rest depended on Howe moving up from New York in 1777. Howe had already left for New York and never received the plans. He was intent on arriving in New York, pulling forces from New Jersey, and planned to attack Philadelphia. Middlecoff actually writes why he made this decision is not clear. Starting in August, early on things were going great for Burgoyne. Successful battles at Fort Anne, and then again he moved south towards Albany at Fort Edwards. Unfortunately, Burgoyne had received news that St. Leger had given up siege at Fort Stanwix, just east of Oswego, and was forced to retreat back to Canada, when Benedict Arnold showed up with reinforcements. Howe at this time is in Pennsylvania defeating Washington at Brandywine, then at Germantown, before leaving for Philadelphia, leaving Burgoyne alone and in need of supplies. Burgoyne decides to continue southward towards Albany, and on September 19th, at Freedman's Farm, the First Battle of Saratoga occurs, and Burgoyne is defeated by General Gates. Gates had arrived almost 4 weeks before Burgoyne and had time to fortify Bemis Heights just above Freedman's Farm. Benedict Arnold had already arrived after successfully pushing St. Leger back to Canada and helped to fortify Bemis Heights. Arnold then convinces Gates to allow him to take on Burgoyne head-on, as General Dan Morgan would follow on his left. The British had taken very heavy casualties on that day. Matter of fact, both sides took heavy losses, but Gates could replace his, Burgoyne could not. 2 days after the battle, Burgoyne received news that General Henry Clinton would come to his aid. But after moving up the Hudson and running into Patriot resistance, he was stopped. Burgoyne, in trouble, tries to reach the river to escape, but was unable to cross. He was forced to accept the terms of surrender. On October 17th, by the terms of the Convention of Saratoga, the British laid down their arms, where over 5,700 men are marched to Boston, where they boarded ships for England. Burgoyne is defeated and humiliated. Gates becomes a great hero of the American Revolution, and as news reaches France, on December 17, 1777, Benjamin Franklin helped to draft the agreement that France would recognize the United States and enter into an alliance. The war was far from over. The British policy turns from the north into a southern campaign, and again, after several great victories but also terrible defeats, the American forces, along with French reinforcements, trapped Cornwallis on October 19th. Almost 4 years after the Battle of Saratoga, Cornwallis surrenders at Yorktown, and the Treaty of Paris of 1783 would officially end the American Revolution. The economic conditions after the American Revolution were very clear. Both sides had accumulated considerable debt. The war cost them approximately $250 million. And the American colonies were looking somewhere at around $150 million in debt. While both suffered economic losses, both Great Britain and the American colonies would create a renewed trading partners with each other. Britain would go on to face France in another conflict, and the American colonies, after the failures of the Articles of Confederation, would create a new constitution and a much sounder economic system that would take them into the 19th century and later become a world economic power. Robert Wilde, in his article, The Effects of the American Revolutionary War on Britain, writes that modern readers might expect Britain to have suffered greatly as a result of losing the war. But the fact is, it's possible to argue that the war was not only survived, but to such an extent that Britain could fight a very long war against Napoleon right next door soon after. The Battle of Saratoga, long considered to be the most decisive battles in the world, is rightly justified as the turning point of the American Revolution. The battle exposed the failures of Great Britain's military leaders in Parliament, as well as solidified the resolve of the American patriots to win their fight for freedom.